Okay, thanks for the very generous introduction. I'm going to ask Ryan to cue up the slides, and hopefully she can. Here we go. So Ryan and I are going to be talking about narcolepsy's impact on social relationships. And this is a project that we have been discussing amongst ourselves and with Wake Up Narcolepsy for several years now, because it's really clear in talking to people with narcolepsy that this is a topic that comes up a lot. Let's go on to the next one. So I do have a couple disclosures. This study was funded by Jazz Pharmaceuticals, and some of the early work that we did getting this going was funded by some of the grants from Wake Up Narcolepsy, which we very much appreciate. I also have other research grants from Merck and Takeda, and I've done some consulting with other companies in the narcolepsy space. So the things that we're going to talk about in this session is just to give a quick overview of what we know about how narcolepsy can impact social life and sort of what we know now, what's the current landscape, and what do we hear from patients in clinic. And then most of the presentation is going to be by Ryan, who's going to focus on what we've learned from this recent questionnaire that we've done and how this sort of leads to some, I think, new and hopefully hopeful perspectives on how to manage some of these things. So the very nature of narcolepsy is such that you would expect it to have some impact on social functioning. You know, this is a disorder that typically comes on in, adolescence and young adulthood. Usually, the peak age of onset for narcolepsy is around 15. And this is really probably the most important time for social development, when people are making, stronger friendships and romantic relationships. And it's clear in just talking to people that the daytime sleepiness and cataplexy can really impact social relationships. Sometimes people are just too tired to do stuff with friends, or they fall asleep in the midst of a party, or they have cataplexy during really awkward times. And further, the very medicines that we use for narcolepsy can cause problems. Medicines can cause sexual difficulties, or they can cause anxiety. And just the very sort of structured life that many people with narcolepsy lead can also have an impact. Many people with narcolepsy are not going to be gung-ho to go out to a party starting at 11 o'clock at night. So on the next slide, we have a few quotes here that came up in the course of our questionnaire about how in these different domains, how narcolepsy can impact people's lives. And so in terms of social relationships, one person wrote, "I limit the amount of social gatherings that I attend per week. I typically can only attend one social gathering." On the romantic side, one person said, "I'm just too tired to plan dates and cook dinners and so forth." Regarding sex, one person said, "I certainly don't have the energy to maintain a normal sexual relationship with my husband." And we hear this a lot, where sometimes people just get in bed and they just clonk right out. So despite the fact that this is a common problem, on the next slide, this is pretty much a summary of the literature thus far, the research that's been done, and it's pretty sparse. And it sort of hints at the problem, but it's never really drilled into it much. Social isolation or awkwardness has been described in about 60% of people with narcolepsy. About half report relationship problems. Mild to moderate difficulties in social functioning have been shown in about 45%. And of course, cataplexy can inhibit and reduce social interaction, and it ends up promoting self-isolation. I had one adult guy who he didn't want to go to his daughter's wedding because he was afraid he's going to have cataplexy and make a scene. And so, that kind of self-imposed isolation, I think, is particularly tragic, because we can usually get cataplexy under good control. The sleepiness in narcolepsy can be really significant, and it's probably one of the main things that contributes to marital stress in about 72% of people. And then, as I mentioned earlier, sleepiness or cataplexy can impact sex itself. And so the Broughton paper, if you're interested in sort of reading some of these things, that Broughton paper from 1994 I thought was quite good, but it's mostly descriptive, and there just hasn't been a very detailed dive into this topic just thus far. So the next slide, I think, is where we hand things over to Ryan. And so, and she's actually going to start off with a poll. So I'm going to go quiet now for the rest of the talk.
So to start, yes, what I want to we talk about the study that we did in terms of young adults and the impact of narcolepsy on their social life. And to start, I was hoping to kind of get a sense from others that are here in this webinar with us of how has narcolepsy impacted either your social life or your loved one's social life. So there's a couple ways that you can answer. If you go to this pollev.com/RyanDavidson302, you can then enter in, it'll ask for your name. You can skip that. You don't have to enter your name. And then you can go from there. Or if you go and you can text 37607 in the to box. And then in the text box, just type Ryan Davidson 302. Send that. You should then get a confirmation. From there, then what you can do is type in a response, just a couple of words of how narcolepsy has impacted your social life. As you guys respond, we should start seeing a couple of words pop up. So we have movies, friends, fall, tired. And so the larger words are words that are popping up more frequently from the people who are participating. And so you can see, it looks like friends, even if there's different pieces of it, that's one of the big things that keeps popping up for a lot of people. I see asleep is growing.
Hey Ryan, I see that one person has put in the chat box that it would be good if you could just repeat the instructions in case it's a little
So if you go to start a new text message, text the to would be 37607. And then in the text box where you would typically type your message, just type Ryan Davidson 302, press send, and then you should receive a message in response saying that you, when you receive the message, it says that you've joined the session, and then you should be able, your next text, it'll pop up on here. And so I think as we look through this, you can see that there's lots and lots of different words that are popping up with, and again, the friend seems to be the largest one so far. But I also see social activities, socially, cataplexy, conversations, plans, feeling, canceling, isolated has popped up, work, asleep. And so now we kind of get this picture of what are some of the things that you've experienced. And so what we wanted to ask, and we asked this of young adults who were 18 to 39, they completed a survey online. We asked questions about their narcolepsy diagnosis, when their symptoms onset, when they received their diagnosis. We asked questions about how narcolepsy impacted their social life, if it made it easier, harder. We asked about their friends, if they had too many, enough, or too few. We also asked about how much time they spent with friends. We asked about history of romantic and sexual relationships and whether they were currently in relationships, the quality of their current relationships. We also asked about how they communicate about their narcolepsy and symptom management with others, including friends, significant others, sexual partners, and also communicating with providers. Is this something that providers ask about? Is this something that they want providers to ask about? We got an overwhelming number of responses. It was actually amazing. Oftentimes in research, it will take weeks to get responses and to kind of meet your recruiting goal. Within 36 hours, we had over 300 participants complete the survey. 262 actually completed the whole survey. We had over 300 start it. And then we had over 78 pages of single-space responses to a handful of open-ended questions that we asked. And I think as we talk through these next parts, also remembering that this was completed during the COVID pandemic, and that comes with its own caveats, as this was a time period where everyone was navigating this unique social isolation. The people who responded were typically female, white, and Caucasian. Most of the participants were employed, whether part-time or full-time, and it was about an even split between type 1 and type 2 narcolepsy. Some of the characteristics in terms of narcolepsy was symptom onset was around age 15, but you can see there was quite a range between 7 to 33. For many of the diagnosis, the average age was 23, but you can see again there's quite that range with 8 to 39, with a huge range of the length of time to onset of diagnosis, with 0 years up to 27 years. And I think with that too, the average length of time in between was about 8 years, which is pretty consistent with what we see in the literature and what patients report. In terms of treatment, I've included the most common medications that participants reported. However, there were a lot more that were included, but these were just the most common. Of note, so stimulants, modafinil, Xyrem, and caffeine, but almost all of the participants were on at least one medication. Only 7% weren't on any medications. And then a third of the participants were on 3 or more medications for their narcolepsy management. In terms of non-medication strategies, these some of the most common included daytime naps, scheduled bedtime, exercise, support groups. And then again, most participants reported that they were utilizing at least one non-medication strategy. And then with over almost 2/3 using 3 or more different strategies. There we go. The most common symptoms, so this was the list of symptoms that we asked in terms of frequency and in addition to how the impact was. For today, we're just going to talk about frequency of experiencing these symptoms ever. Almost every single participant reported feeling excessive sleepiness, with many reporting brain fog, disrupted nighttime sleep, automatic behaviors, and sleep attacks. And then you can see the other symptoms down to cataplexy, which was about 60%, which fits with that kind of type 1, type 2 split. We also wanted to look at common comorbidities, as these might also have impact on social relationships. And you can see that anxiety and depression were the most common comorbidities. I want to make note that we had asked if they had ever been diagnosed by a medical provider or a psychological provider with these. And so even though depression showed up as a symptom for narcolepsy, I think of that as kind of little d depression. We all experience depressive symptoms at times. Whereas on this slide, depression, I think of as kind of this big D depression, which is a diagnosis of a depressive disorder. You can also see migraines and PTSD were common, but about 1/5 of the participants did not report any comorbidities. When talking about narcolepsy and social life, I think we were both surprised and not surprised by that not a single participant reported that narcolepsy makes their social life easier, whether a lot or somewhat. And I think, again, remembering that this was during the COVID pandemic. So it's hard to, one of the things that we're hoping to do is hoping to rerun this study next summer in a time where there's not as much social isolation, so we can get a better sense of, is this pretty typical? But again, at the same time, like even just in our word cloud, one of the biggest things that we saw was we saw friends and we saw isolated pop up. A couple of quotes that came through were also, this was one where maintaining most relationships takes a lot of effort with my narcolepsy. While it may be due to other issues that amplify this, it is still incredibly hard to maintain most relationships with people my own age because of my sleep schedule. And the other is, when friends know about it, they understand why I might have to say, sorry, I'd love to meet up for dinner in 30 minutes, but I just got off work and have to nap first, and won't think I'm weird or trying to avoid them. So a couple of things that I also mentioned, we asked about friendships and how often they see friends. About half of the participants reported that they see friends once or twice a week, with 20% reporting that they don't see friends at all. 50% reporting that they felt like they had too few friends, whereas the other 50% reported that they had just the right amount of friends. Only one participant reported that they had too many friends. And then I think the other striking piece was this loneliness scale score. So it was, the average score was a 9.2 out of 12, with higher scores indicating greater loneliness. And while we don't have clinical cutoffs for this scale, it was interesting to see just how high kind of the whole distribution was over towards this higher end of the loneliness. And again, one of our questions is this typical, or was this also because we were asking these questions in the context of a pandemic where people were already being socially isolated on top of the isolation that they might feel related to their narcolepsy? So then we talked about, well, what about for entering romantic relationships? We saw a similar finding in terms of that no one identified that narcolepsy makes entering a relationship easier. But however, you can see it's a little bit more distributed between makes it somewhat harder versus a lot harder, with fewer participants noting that it makes it a lot harder compared to the friendship group. And then are a couple of different quotes that stuck out to us from the open-ended responses. It is incredibly difficult to manage romantic relationships. Even those that are fully informed can still bristle at how much you sleep, whether you wake up late or go to bed early, and often are hurt when you fall asleep watching a movie together. So I try to inform partners as if it's a quirky thing about me they should be aware of and understanding of, but that I'm perfectly capable and strong. Another participant wrote, I use online and dating apps to meet romantic partners. I rarely drink alcohol and schedule dates around daily naps, limit my driving distance, and limit too much physical activity. So these are some of the ways that people were talking about how they're able to manage their narcolepsy when they're starting to enter a relationship. Some other stats, and I think this one it was interesting for us, is that my social life has fallen to almost nothing. If not for my wife, I feel like I would be completely alone. And we saw several of these quotes where it seems like the romantic relationships were really important for the participants. 95% of the participants reported that they had had at least one sexual or romantic relationship. And of note that this question was specifically relationships that lasted more than 3 months. The average number of relationships was 2 to 3, so is that 2.87. Interestingly, 31% of participants reported that narcolepsy symptoms contributed to a past breakup. Even though with kind of these pieces where it's unclear really kind of if there's the negative aspect with romantic relationships, 74% reported that they were currently living with a romantic partner, and 43% reported that they were currently married. And I think that with this 43%, it's important to note too that we have data about the frequency and marriage rates for participants and for people who are around this age group, so young adults. And so, which is pretty similar to this 43%. I think in some other studies, we see it somewhere around 46, 47%. And so for us, it was really encouraging that we saw that people with narcolepsy were married at about equal rates as people without a chronic medical condition. And I think that this speaks to also the quality of the romantic relationships that our participants reported, and that most participants reported that they were completely satisfied or almost completely satisfied in their relationship, with not a single one indicating that they were not at all satisfied. In terms of who's getting the better deal out of the relationship, you can see that kind of the middle number of we're both equal was about half of participants reported that. Otherwise, some of the things that popped up were I am somewhat, or the partner is somewhat, but very few people reported that they were getting a much better deal or their partner was getting a much better deal. And then I think the other thing would be when we were looking at the support systems for multidimensional perceived support scale, we were looking at in terms of how supported do participants feel by their significant others, their family, and their friends. And you can see that all of these kind of fit. In each of the scales, participants reported that they were kind of in this moderate support group. Which was reassuring in that we weren't seeing that they were reporting that they felt low support from either of these groups or overall. And when we looked at differences between these different types of social supports, There was a significant difference in that the support received by significant others was greater than the support received by family and friends, but that family and friends were found to be about equally supportive. And again, the fact that all of these fell into the moderate support group was reassuring. In terms of sexual relationships, 80% of the participants reported that narcolepsy in some way has impacted their sex life. About half reported that narcolepsy had that they had impacted in terms of they'd experienced cataplexy at any point in their past or fallen asleep at any point in their past. And then I think in terms of their current impact, only 37% reported that cataplexy or falling asleep was currently impacting their sex life. So even though these might have been things that they've experienced in the past, whether it was through medication or non-medication treatment options, these were things that had, it looks like, at least statistically, had improved over time, though there was still a significant number of people reporting that. The next part that we mentioned was communicating with others. In terms of when do you talk about narcolepsy with others? Some of the quotes that I've already mentioned include that it's important for their friends to be aware, or it's important for their romantic partner to be aware. And I think this quote also kind of gives you a little bit of this as well. And I usually disclose it when I feel like it will impact my relationship with the person in some way. Being able to explain that I may be too tired to hang out, or that I need to go to bed at a certain time because of narcolepsy helps reduce the amount they might try to convince me to do something that will make me feel worse later. And so the importance of being able to communicate, we asked in terms of both friendships, romantic relationships, and sexual relationships. So you can see that they're not all the same responses because we asked the questions slightly differently. For friends and romantic partners, we asked the same question for each. In terms of at what point in the relationship do you tell the person about your diagnosis and symptoms? And you can see immediately people are more likely to talk to their romantic partners about their diagnosis. Compared to friends, there might be a little bit less likely immediately, but most will still, the highest percentage was still within that less than 1 month of when they get to know someone. So about half of romantic partners, or actually almost 2/3, fit within that less than 1 month to immediately, whereas a fewer percentage, but still high for friends, are within that range. And then you can see it kind of tapers down over the 1 to 6 months, 6 months to a year, more than a year, with a few participants reporting that they generally don't disclose. And then in terms of sexual relationships, we asked if this was something that they talked about to their sexual partners, as they may have more casual partners or they may not necessarily be in a relationship. And so it was interesting in that 41% will always disclose to a partner, with about 20% saying most of the time they will. However, at the same time, 20% said sometimes they disclose, and then almost 20% said that they never disclose. So our next poll, so this one you don't have to text in the Ryan Davidson to the 37607 if you've already done it. You can just text the 37607, either A or B. But we wanted to get a sense of, like, has your doctor asked you about your social life? We just went through a bunch of data about how narcolepsy can really seriously impact your social life, and we saw on the first word cloud that the friends, the isolated, were words that popped up for many of you. And so wanting to get a sense of, like, is this something that has been asked? So I'll give everyone a couple moments. If you weren't able to log in for the word cloud, you will have to go through either the website or text the Ryan Davidson 302 and to that number first, and then you can enter A or B. You will only be able to enter A or B once, so you won't get to answer multiple times. So it's pretty stable at this point in terms of it's around 70% said that their doctor has not asked about their social life, with 30% saying that yes, they have. I'll give you another moment. this is actually, it was almost exactly the same breakdown in terms of what the participants in the survey said as well. In terms of 67% said that the doctor has not asked about their social life, and 31% have. In our survey, we were a little bit more specific about which doctor. We said if it was a doctor who was specifically treating your narcolepsy, if they've asked. We also asked about, has your doctor asked about your sex life? And here the answer was overwhelmingly no, that this was not something that their doctor had asked. Now, as providers, it's something that, you know, when I was on the consult service, these were questions that I asked to almost every single person that I met while I was at the hospital. And they're questions that we do get used to asking, but just because we ask or we may or may not ask, it's still important to know whether this is something that's important to you and to patients and to families. Like, oftentimes we see that many times these issues don't get brought up if the question's not asked. And also because, you know, talking about sex and talking about falling asleep during sex or cataplexy during sex, or the role that it's having in the social life might be a little bit sensitive, it's also important to figure out, like, is this something that you want doctors to ask? So that brings us to our next poll question. Same thing, if you've already responded, you don't have to text in the Ryan Davidson again, but you can text A or B to whether or not you want your doctor to ask about your social life, is this question particularly. So pretty quickly we have most people do want your doctors to ask about your social life. But we'll give it a moment to see if it balances out or changes. It's nice to kind of get this like live feedback. It was fun to see in the last one how close it was to what we saw in the study. And again, you can also use the website pollev.com/RyanDavidson302. So it stayed pretty consistent. So we'll move on to what we found in our survey. So it's about somewhere between 85 to 90% do want your doctor to ask about your social life, which was, again, relatively consistent with what we had found in our study. As a fewer people I didn't give you the don't know option in our poll, but we saw about 73% said that yes, they do want their doctors to ask about their social life. In terms of asking about their sex life, there was a little bit like less certainty in terms of about 45% said yes, only 25% said no, and 31% were unsure and reported that they don't know. And so this was really important for us as providers to be able to say, you know, this was something that is important that people want their doctors to ask. And I think that's one of our key takeaways as well, is not only the information that we're learning, but also how do we get this information back to providers so that way we can, as providers, we can ask these questions and kind of get better answers. A couple of our take-home messages. I think the biggest piece is if you felt like you feel isolated or it's hard to have friendships, or that narcolepsy is impacting your social life, you're not alone. Many people find that narcolepsy makes social and romantic or sexual relationships more challenging, and that both symptoms and symptom management strategies can make it challenging to manage your time with friends and romantic sexual partners. I think the other piece of it is yes, you're not alone, and it's not a completely dire message of narcolepsy has to negatively impact your social life. Again, we're hoping to get a better sense of where some of the findings related to COVID and the social isolation with the pandemic, or is this really the kind of the baseline for many participants with narcolepsy? But with that too, there were some other pieces that were really important, in that there's other relationships that really are important and meaningful. And so yes, there's only so much time or energy within a day, but we can see that, you know, some of the other quotes were, I really just have to pick one or two people to invest my time in and focus on them. I don't have time for others. Or I really only have the energy to maintain a few meaningful relationships. Therefore, I only have my boyfriend and my best friend, excluding my family. Do not go out and socialize at all, but spend my time at home nurturing my romantic relationship because it's the most important to me. And I think this is one where it's, you know, we can get this information and say, yes, there are challenges, but it's also really reassuring that the quality of romantic relationships is still really strong, that people are cohabitating and living with their partners about the same amount of time that we would see in other populations without narcolepsy. But it also highlights that we need to do more. As a field, we need to really start paying attention to what are some of the social implications of narcolepsy, so that way in the future we can identify, like, what are some interventions that can be helpful. You know, is it in terms of medication side effects or some of the non-medication strategies that are impacting the social life? How do we then implement interventions or strategies or brainstorm to really be able to figure out what is the best way to help you pick the relationships that are important to you and make sure that you have the energy and the time to invest in the things that are important. All of this is a big thank you. So Dr. Eric Zhu, Dr. Thomas Scammell, also Kelsey Biddle were a part of our research team from the very beginning in developing and designing the survey, and then in terms of data analysis and kind of figuring out what does all of this mean. We're also incredibly grateful for the financial support from Jazz Pharmaceuticals and Wake Up Narcolepsy, as Dr. Scammell indicated in the beginning. And all 262 plus the other participants who started, but the 262 who completed, we're really, really thankful for their participation. Also, the survey questionnaire was distributed by Wake Up Narcolepsy Network, and the Hypersomnia Foundation, and Project Sleep, which is, I think, a big reason why we were able to get such an amazing response in such a short period of time. So I want to make sure that we leave room for questions. And so I'll kind of exit out of the screen sharing so that way we can answer any questions that you guys might have.
Thank you so much for that incredible opportunity to feel part of research in the moment. That was really unique and really helpful, I think, in terms of us feeling engaged. So I'm going to invite our audience to write in the Q&A. And I've got a few questions already, so I'll start with those while you all pop in your questions. So did this study address type 1 or type 2 narcolepsy?
We do have that data, we just haven't gotten to the point of being able to separate it out yet, but it is one of the questions that we're looking forward to asking and getting more information.
Right, thank you.
Our intuition, Claire, is that, you know, sleepiness and some of the other symptoms of narcolepsy tend to be a bit worse in type 1. And so it's possible we may see a little bit more skewing in that, a greater impact on social relations in the type 1, but we don't know yet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Someone said, it looks like you have the research that shows that people with narcolepsy do face social isolation. What do we do to counteract that?
I think this is our next steps as well, is trying to get a sense of, as we go through particularly the open-ended responses, what are particular barriers, and getting more fine-tuned in our understanding of the pieces that really play a role in feeling so isolated, and then identifying how, you know, from a clinical perspective, oftentimes when I work with people with chronic medical conditions, it's identifying values and trying to find ways of working through some of the barriers that come up because of the medical condition. And in which case, in terms of narcolepsy, identifying, like, is it sleepiness? Is it the side effects? Is it the structure? And as we get that information, we can tailor more effective interventions and start really thinking through, how do we improve this for people with narcolepsy?
So once you've got your data finished, how do all the other sleep specialists get this information so that habits and change, as it were, in the doctor's office? What's the process?
I think it's going to be a long process. Dr. Scammell, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. I think some of the pieces are starting to publish and trying to get these written up. Also being able to do presentations like these and talk to people, so that way we can kind of get the word out there, whether it's for patients, parents, caregivers, loved ones, so that way they can also advocate. And then I think the biggest thing is just getting in the information out there that this is a problem, this is something that patients want to talk about, and using that is really a big piece of our message.
So, we'll do our part as academics, to go to meetings and spread the word. And we're planning to write probably at least 2 papers out of this, if not more. But that's going to take time. And I think getting doctors and other healthcare providers to change their habits is going to be a challenge. And so what can change today is that patients and their families can make a point of bringing these things up with their providers. Because I think, if you really say, I'm having a hard time with, whatever it is, finding time for friendships or even specific sexual problems, there's a pretty good chance that the doctor or nurse or psychologist will have something helpful to say in those regards.
Thank you. Okay, so from Lisa Marshall, would you consider doing the same survey with teenagers?
I think there's probably a couple questions we might tweak a little bit more, but I think the idea is that a lot of the questions that we asked were also asked in kind of larger adolescent like surveys. So it's definitely something that we could consider. It gets a little trickier in terms of how to get the surveys out with teenagers.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some sort of legal-ish issues around us just sending these things out and asking very delicate questions. But it's something that I think is really important because, as we said at the beginning, developing social skills begins early. And we would love to be able to, help get, 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds on the right track.
Yeah, that's a good question. So Anna Menzies asks, of all the sleep disorders out there, why did you both decide to focus on narcolepsy research specifically? A little bit about you two, I think, is what I'm sensing from people.
Yeah, maybe I'll start this one. So I've been putting most of my energy into narcolepsy research for about 25 years now. And I think it's really important clinically. I think I love hearing the patient's stories. And as some of you might know, I also am a neuroscience researcher, and I love the fact that we now have a better understanding of what's going on in the brain and that we can really ask very detailed, scientifically precise questions. And yet, while I work on neurotransmitters and circuits in the brain, there's these huge questions on the other sort of end of the spectrum of like, well, what about social interaction? And that has nothing to do with brain circuits specifically, but it has to do with a very important life, day-to-day question. And so, I guess I'd been hearing about social issues from my patients for several years, and it came up in discussions with Claire and other people, talking about this is a real deal for kids and their families and adults with narcolepsy. And so it was clear that we needed to work on this. And so then we teamed up with Ryan and Eric Zhou and Kelsey Biddle, and it was really nice to have everybody's perspectives to blend our skills.
Yeah, we very much appreciate it. The passion that you both have comes across actually in the Q&A as well. And one person asked that Dr. Ryan Davidson is so passionate. Does she herself have narcolepsy? I'm not sure you need to answer that, but it's just to communicate how certainly your commitment to our community has been communicated today. Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions, and there's so many, but let's try this one. What advice do you have for single mothers with narcolepsy and toddlers?
Oh, I love the littles. So that's what I'm working at right now as well. But I do a lot of parent work. And it's, first of all, just being a parent of a toddler is hard, let alone being a parent if you have a single parent, and then also a parent with a chronic medical condition like narcolepsy. It's a lot of it is finding ways to kind of what's important to you, and working with providers, whether it's your medical provider, if you have your own psychologist, and really figuring out and brainstorming some strategies of what do you feel is missing in terms of parenting and the parent you want to be, and then also kind of where can you go and what are some of the things that are getting in the way.
I would just add, from a medical perspective, this really does impact our decisions around medications and so forth, and that there's some medicines that are really not necessarily a good choice for a single mom. particularly with a young child. So for instance, Xyrem can be very, very sedating. And if you can't hear your baby cry at night because of the Xyrem, that's going to be a problem. And so these are things we try to factor in.
Okay, so we have an anonymous question about therapy. Do you know how many people with narcolepsy see a therapist? And if so, do they find it beneficial? I think, in other words, would you recommend psychotherapy for people with narcolepsy?
I don't, Dr. Scammell, do you know numbers in terms of how often people see therapists?
Yeah, I can't quote anything. I would say it's a minority of patients who have told me that they're seeing a therapist. And yet, I think it depends on somebody's circumstances. Everybody, manages things differently, and some people, really embrace those approaches. Others are not as comfortable with it. And so I think it really whatever suits you. And I guess the message that comes from the data that Ryan showed is that life is more of a struggle when you've got a chronic disease, and narcolepsy in particular. And so, getting that outside help, particularly if you feel like you're not getting it from your friends and family already, I think is really important to reach out, because there's some great resources.
I'm definitely on the bias side in terms of, as someone who provides therapy, I do recommend therapy. Like, if you're questioning whether or not therapy would be helpful, it's usually a good sign of at least meeting a therapist and seeing if it's helpful. Oftentimes I encourage people that if you don't click on that first session, it's okay. Give it a try for another session or two, and if you're still not clicking, then still you can ask for referrals too. It is about fit with the provider.
And this next question kind of refers somewhat to COVID. It is, I have actually benefited from stay at home because online relationships play to my strengths. Could isolation have been improved? Sorry, could isolation have improved people's lives this year?
It's interesting. The pandemic has sort of very mixed effects. And, I think for people who are prone towards feeling anxious, they're way more anxious right now. People who are depressed and isolated, they probably are feeling more depressed. But it does have the blessing of, no more commutes for many people, not everybody, but some people, more flexibility. If you're working from home, you can fit in naps more easily. But that's about it. Still, it's still pretty tough. And also, when Ryan was talking about sort of, single moms with young children, it's like, oh my goodness, what a challenge right now.
Yeah, extraordinary. Actually, Ferry mentions, sort of on the back of that question, how can you settle for your social relationships when they only exist at home? That is still isolation too. So I wanted to put those two questions out there because of your particular research. And the references you both made to doing that this year during our extraordinary experience with COVID. So how can you settle for your social relationships when they only truly exist at home?
So some of the other, we did ask questions related to how often people were seeing friends or others via virtually versus in person, to try and at least tease some of that out. We haven't looked at that data yet. And we also asked questions about the COVID response in particular and how that's impacted our participants. But I think, with that, it is like being home, relationships are going to look different. And for some people, I think, online relationships are easier if you can engage virtually. And for some people, it can feel more isolating. And so it's figuring out, for you, if in person is much more kind of your style and what's helpful for you, identifying strategies with your providers to, are there safe socially distanced ways to interact with people. Oftentimes people will report that even video chat can be helpful versus just a phone, because then you get that visual information with someone. But there are some people, especially if you're on Zoom all day long for work, where you just don't want to engage with someone virtually after being on Zoom all day. And so there's a lot of challenges that come with that.
We have a parent here that says her daughter's biggest complaint is memory loss, and it affects her ability to be social or even converse with her family. Have you got any thoughts on that? She's actually 22 and just come off of Xyrem and is now on modafinil. Probably a question for you, Dr. Scammell.
Yeah, so as best we understand, the memory problems from narcolepsy really stem from sleepiness and the inattention that comes with that. And that if somebody's so tired and they're having a lot of brain fog and they just can't focus, of course it's going to impact their memory. We don't think that there's any fundamental memory problem per se. And so the goal really is to focus on trying to get somebody to an adequate level of alertness. And that's where the various wake promoting medications come in. And all I could say for that particular person is, really try to connect with a sleep doc who knows narcolepsy well and understands the various drugs and their pluses and minuses.
Okay, I think we just have time for one more question, and that is from Frida, and she says, would hypnotherapy help with my type 1 narcolepsy symptoms? I have no idea.
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, none of us know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't.
Okay.
I've not heard. I've heard of, in sleep medicine, we sometimes use hypnotherapy for things like frequent nightmares, and insomnia and stuff like that. I guess it depends on what the nature of the problem is.
Frequently in pain management. I know in our GI department, we have a couple of therapists who are trained in hypnosis, in terms of like abdominal pain particularly.
And I just thought of one patient who had very severe cataplexy who saw a therapist who taught her some self-hypnosis techniques to help her get better control of her cataplexy and sort of manage the triggers better.
Wow, that's intriguing. Thank you. I think we probably need to wrap this session up as I introduced Dr. Maskey, but I'd really like to thank you both. That was extremely informative and helpful and really encouraging, I think, going forward, because you're sort of working on a subject that we as a community often feel is under-recognised. So I hope you're successful. I'm sure you will be in your peer review process, publication, and we look forward to this making changes in the doctor's office. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.